Well, welcome everybody who is out there on Zoom. Zoomers. Good to have you with us. Thank you all for being here. And I just want to start off that I would ask those of you who are on Zoom to please feel free at any time to chime in. We're more than willing to take your questions. And as a matter of fact, I want to say to everybody, please, at any time, just chime in and, we can, make it more valuable to you all. Because I do not know everything about the U.S. Navy or about the Civil War. As a matter of fact, I can tell you this without hesitation, that the more I learn, the more I know what I don't know. And you always have to learn more. And the more courses I take, the more I feel like I learn. The more courses I give, the more I learn. So it's a great combination of things, and especially since this is such an integral part of our American history, that, I appreciate you being here and sharing that interest. And those of you who are not here but who are watching, please feel free to join in. I wanted to start off just by explaining a little bit that in my readings, I never really paid much attention to the U.S. Navy. It was always about the Army and the Confederate Army and the United States armies, and all of the problems that Lincoln had, especially with finding the right leaders, especially for the Army of the Potomac. It took him a good solid 2.5 years to find a handful of people, especially the leading general of the Army, to really be able to lead, take charge, and be decisive. When it comes to the Navy, he didn't have any of that problem. Gideon Welles was appointed by Lincoln as the Secretary of the Navy in March, or right before March, when he became president. And Gideon Welles was a great choice for being the Secretary of the Navy. He had been involved in operations during the Mexican War. And he was, for a number of years, he was in charge of logistics in the Navy. He was in charge of provisions and clothing for the Navy for about 4 or 5 years. But he learned between his experience in the Gulf and fighting off of the Mexican coast and amphibious operations in that case, as well as the logistics of it all. It gave him a great perspective on how to deal with things. Now, when he became Secretary of the Navy, there wasn't really a war going on yet. Nothing, it hadn't quite happened. But it quickly came upon him that he had a lot to do. But as it happens, for people like me who really has a strong interest in the Civil War, I didn't feel like the Navy, I couldn't really relate too much to how the Navy and Army, operated. It was all about the Army. And I first thing I thought of today when I was thinking about how to present this was about the Battle of Shiloh. And, with the Battle of Shiloh on the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing, which is the southern part of Tennessee, almost at the Mississippi border, Grant and Sherman were defeated the first day, pushed up against the river. And then what happened? The steamers with General Buell came up the river and reinforced Grant guarded by gunboats. The steamers with an additional 14,000 troops, and they debarked and basically took the initiative the very next morning and drove the Confederate Army right off the field, which they had worked so hard to gain the next day. Well, And I never really thought much about where those boats came from. Who made them? Where were they? And when I started to do this research for this class last year at Washington College, I started finding out that there was no real navy, certainly not a river navy, but the United States in 1861 had to have two navies, an ocean-going navy and a river fleet. And those are completely different types of craft that needed to be, created and built upon. Certainly the frigates of the old Navy, the pre-war Navy, were very useful. They had 30, 40, 50 guns in some places. But they were not immediately, they were available, but at the beginning in 1861, when the war broke out, the 42 ships of the United States Navy, of those, only about 10 or 12 were in, on the U.S. side. The rest of them were all around the world guarding U.S. interests from pirates. And all of a sudden, those priorities changed. And so they started bringing boats back, ships back as they could. But it was a major problem. And certainly the ships, the boats that helped Grant win the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, they weren't part of the Navy at all. So that's the background of the perspective that I developed as I started to do this course. Let me do this. And this is an example of the different, but I'm going to go back to this so that we can get everything in perspective. But those are the different types. They don't look the same. They are all somewhat different sizes. And interestingly, this is the USS Monitor, the true ironclad ship. And look how smaller it is than these other ships. The Monitor was, I guess, more of a river type ship, but it was seaworthy, out in the ocean, because it did travel out in the ocean as well. But the fact is that the Monitor was a small thing, and most of these other ships, although they have metal and armor, they have low draft. They could deal with the shallow places in some of the rivers, so many of which rivers aren't very wide in places and had curves and needed to be controlled better. So we'll go back to that. There is your basic anaconda plan. As Winfield Scott, the old first general in chief in 1861, created this fabulous idea of strangling the Confederacy economically and with trade, and preventing them to have economic trade with Europe and elsewhere in the world. And it was a really great idea. On paper, it worked great. But, with so few ships and with these other countries having their ships to move cotton back and forth and other things to the south, to the seceded south, they needed to do something fast. And certainly there was nothing to work in the Western theater, the rivers to control the war there. So it was great. The U.S. had 42 ships in April of 1861, but fewer than a dozen were available for duty to block the southern ports. Yes.
They, I don't know if it's a proper word, conscripted boats, private boats to be used in the Civil War.
They didn't conscript. They bought. Okay. The U.S. did, because the U.S. had we had the treasury, we had, we lost a bunch of states and the taxation from those states, but there was still enough to go around. And the Lincoln administration, through the Congress, remember the Congress changed because when the Southern delegations left, it left only the North, and the North was committed to supporting the war, and so they committed to financing the war. That's why, they couldn't afford to buy things. And so that's what they did. They used what was available. They adapted what was available, especially for the river fleet. And then they sort of purchased and brought back the ships that they had in different parts of the world to build the blockade.
That would take a while.
Yeah.
Radio over to
It takes you a year to get over there to tell
Well,
them.
that's right. That's right. And so that was the immediate. I mean, immediate, but it was an issue for a year and a half probably before they could get some more ships in. And then it was arming other ones, and there was never enough. There never was enough. But it had whatever they did had to be wisely applied. And I think I give credit to the top leadership of the Navy that actually got that done. But at the outset, they had a great plan, but no assets to actually execute the plan. So this is where Mr. Wells comes in. Gideon Wells was involved in the Navy prior to becoming Secretary of the Navy, and he knew his way around. I'm sure when Lincoln hired him or got him to be the secretary, he couldn't really foresee the overall full need that he was going to have to rely on Mr. Wells. Mr. Wells was most famous, and I always knew of Gideon Wells because he was the guy who, sitting next to Lincoln when Lincoln passed away, said, now he belongs to the ages. If you said, who was Gideon Wells? I think now he belongs to the ages. That's what Gideon Wells' contribution was. He was just Secretary of the Navy, what could that mean? Well, I learned a whole lot since then. So he was a northerner. He was a Connecticut guy. He wasn't a shipbuilder or anything. He was a politician, really, and a businessman. But he was sort of an abolitionist, and that sort of he was a mild abolitionist. And that's what got him Lincoln's attention, and he gave Lincoln a lot of support during the campaign of 1860, helped him get elected, in the North. So that attracted Lincoln, and that Lincoln gave him the job of Secretary of the Navy, and rightly so, because of his involvement in the Mexican War and in after the Mexican War, in the Navy hierarchy. And so he went right to work, and he had two basic jobs: to build a fleet, a river fleet, and to adapt the boats that were available on the rivers, as well as to bring all those other 42 ships, the other 30 whatever ships back that weren't local, beyond the 12, and then continue to build and grow the Navy. And, of course, take advantage of inventors like John Erickson, who was building the first monitor, the USS Monitor, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so he was aware of the Monitor being built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, or at least to talk about it, from Andrew Foote, who ran the Brooklyn Navy Yard and was one of Wells's inner circle of leaders right from the outset. So in the South, the southern states have 3,500 miles of coastline. If you're talking about a blockade, that's a big blockade. Now, you don't have to, cover every single mile. You have to focus on where the ports are, but you also have to think about the logistics of trying to get that done. And so what he realized right away was that you needed to have bases on the coast to where not only the gunships your frigates that were armed with numerous cannon, but you needed to service those vessels. There had to be, supply ships, and you're always supplying things. So there was a lot more than just gunships that they had to use. But one of the important things that they did right away, that Wells saw to, was the blockade board. He appointed people, and he used Augustus Fox, who was the assistant secretary of the Navy, who also knew Lincoln, who Lincoln had sent on the Fort Sumter mission, and brought the garrison back in Fort Sumter, after the surrender. But Augustus Fox was an inside guy for Wells, and they worked pretty well together. They pretty much did their own thing, and they, most importantly, cooperated with each other and weren't public backstabbers. Somehow, I think that on the Navy side, they managed to avoid a lot of the public rancor in Congress, in the halls of Congress, and in the newspapers, unlike that which beset the Army from the very outset. So that was one advantage of the relative anonymity of the Navy. It was a much smaller operation back in 1861. So Wells, his responsibility was to implement the Anaconda Plan. There was no plan B. That was always the adopted plan from the very beginning of the Civil War for the North. And I have to say, rightly so. I mean, it was a pretty good idea of how to defeat the Confederacy. One of the things, and I think maybe the best thing that Wells did, was he dropped the seniority system. He paid no attention to who the senior guys were. As a matter of fact, he went and found some pretty famous names. People became famous later on. But he, in the first months of the war, promoted these guys and gave them major responsibilities, especially in the blockading ocean-going Navy squadron. He named Samuel DuPont, who was on the seniority, 19th on the seniority list. But he knew that this guy was aggressive. He had because of his experience with the Navy and knowing a lot of people and being well connected, he knew that DuPont was an aggressive commander. He found aggressive people. Louis Goldsborough was promoted over 14 others. Admiral Farragut promoted over 37 other people to be in charge of one of the blockading squadrons. It is on the Gulf side.
Good judge of character.
Right, and skill and aggressiveness. Aggressiveness, but still have to be skilled. I mean, you had some generals who were tremendously aggressive, but in a suicidal kind of way. And so this is the gift that Wells brought to the Navy. And amazingly enough, he got this done. He didn't have to, I'm sure he replaced several people. But for the most part, the people that he appointed early on in the war became his stalwarts and stayed largely through the whole war. And as more and more assets came available, the ocean-going Navy became pretty effective at blocking the ports. And what did they do? Well, before I get into how they did it, I just wanted to make the point that Welles's appointments were fabulous the first time around, and that is, I think a major accomplishment for any leader with all that pressure on him, or her, but on him in this case. One of the others that he promoted early was John Dahlgren, who was he was the artillery specialist. He was the guy who really knew as much as anybody about the latest achievements in artillery size, accuracy, and distance. And he put him in charge of that. The Dahlgren guns, were a whole set of artillery that gave his ships, all of his ships, or many of his ships, a lot of the great accuracy and power that they used to bring down these forts along the Atlantic coast. Yes.
Do you know, did he know these guys or had he just heard of them? Well, because I'm like, Bureau of Provisions and Clothing, how much contact would he have had?
Probably not that much, because they were all spread out and they didn't transport very well. When you're out on a boat on the ocean, you're not
Yeah,
exactly
that's
around the corner. So the point is that he knew of them, but some of them were younger than others. Now, interestingly, I noticed that a lot of the top leaders were born just after the turn of the 19th century. Wells was like 1804. Other of these guys were 1810, 1805, 1802. And very few of them, Gustavus Fox and James Eads, they were born in 1820. So those newer guys, they had a different perspective, but there was a great mix, I thought, in ages to where they were able to use the wisdom of the old mind group, but also the new view of this younger group. I say younger in 1822. But interestingly enough, whereas most of the generals in the Civil War were graduates of the United States Military Academy from both sides, virtually none of these guys went to the Naval Academy, because the Naval Academy didn't exist until 1845 in the first place. So these guys came to the Navy and to the Naval Department from all walks of life and from different kinds of backgrounds, engineers, and so the technical
Grandfathered in.
well, I suppose, but that I thought that was an interesting point, because none of them went to an academy that didn't exist. So the point is that they came in with a very wide range of ideas and concepts. And like, for example, where Dahlgren got his, I think it was his family that owned the munitions factory. And that's where he learned it. James Eads, who I'll get to in a minute, is crucial in Mississippi. He was just dirt poor as a child, and learned from one of his employers in the St. Louis area as a teenager. But somehow, from this wide, crazy way of getting educated about the ocean and about the rivers, they got that education, and the Civil War gave them the opportunity to apply it. And Gideon Wells recognized it and gave them the opportunity and the responsibility. And most of these guys bore that responsibility and basically cooperated with each other. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Gustavus Fox accompanied the Fort Sumter Relief Party down to Fort Charleston. And his objective was to try to relieve Fort Sumter and get supplies to them without military reinforcements. That was Lincoln's promise to the governor of South Carolina, Pickens. And of course, they wouldn't let him do that. And so basically, he couldn't prevent the attack on Fort Sumter that was going to happen. But what he was able to do was remove the troops that surrendered, and he was able to evacuate them, and they evacuated to New York afterward. And for that, he had a lot of visibility. And he was a Navy guy. And Wells and Lincoln put him, Gustavus Fox, in charge of the blockade board. And this was an important group of experienced leaders, naval, admiral type, that level of officer. And what they did was they charted all of the southern coastal fortifications. We will go back later on and look at the map, and I'll show you where basically the forts were, especially in North Carolina, South Carolina, down into Florida, Mississippi, and of course the New Orleans area. So they were all fortified. But what this group did was not only did they look at where the cities were, they looked at where they could set up bases, because the initial goal was to set up an Atlantic headquarters and a Gulf headquarters, to where supply ships, so that the ships didn't have to go all the way up to Washington for supply and all that. They could be supplied right out of safe places along the coast that could be fortified by troops, by Army troops, and to give the Navy basically a port in enemy territory.
So they expected on continental United States to base, even though it was the Confederacy.
Right. And there were weak spots, and they found them.
Oh,
And that's only because they had the sense to look at the place, to look at the whole coast. Remember, they were the Navy prior to the war, and they went back and forth, and it was 1800, not 1500, and so the maps of the cities and inlets, especially, the Hatteras Inlet and all these, they were mapped out for navigation, but now they were being mapped out for military purposes and resupply purposes. These guys are smart, and they knew what they had to get done. They couldn't do it quite yet, but they set up their goals without much hesitation at all.
How did they get, where's that place, Royal Sound?
Yeah, Port Royal. It's in South Carolina.
Okay, now, the South Carolinians were really adamant about, defeating the Continental Army, and I'm surprised they allowed them to stay there, that place. They didn't send an army in there.
Well, their job was to defend the cities. They had to keep the blockade from closing up all of their ports. So they couldn't send that, and they were largely also put in places that were inaccessible to railroads, where they couldn't keep moving, troops back and forth. Although I know Lee, in 1860, prior to Gettysburg, he sent Longstreet's, not a division, he sent Pickett's division of Longstreet's Corps down to the North Carolina coast, because they were threatening in the northern part of North Carolina, the port that connected a railroad with the southernmost part of Virginia, right off Elizabeth City. And so those were the kinds of things that Lee was aware of, because these incursions, the Yankee ships, were starting to threaten these supply bases that the Confederacy absolutely needed. Who knew? But that's the way it worked. And so once the blockade board was able to charter topographical and hydrographic, that's what they did. I had to look it up. I never heard of it. So basically, it's charting each of the towns and the cities on bays, on the bays, and understanding how the depths and what kind of ships could get in and out, and what kind of ships could carry, numbers of regiments of troops to be dropped off at a certain place and stay there. Which places can be defended from Confederate troops as they just stay there. They're stationed you have a couple of thousand men stationed at Port Royal, South Carolina, and their whole job is to defend the port, the Union facility in that area. And somehow they did it because there were virtually none of the Union port bases were successfully attacked and overrun in the course of the 4 years of the war. And they were a true threat. And the longer the war went on, the more powerful the Union forces became. The blockading squadrons became more and more effective, not only on the Atlantic side, but on the Gulf side. And to boost that, soon after, it was right around the beginning of 1862, Mr. Wells decided that he was going to put two bases on the Atlantic side, two bases on the Gulf side, and he did it. And that's why he appointed Farragut, because Farragut was the guy who was on the New Orleans area of the Gulf blockading squadron. So as more ships came online, he started to expand. He knew where he could put a base, and from that base, he could widely, block the mouth of the Mississippi River. Not an easy thing to do, and an even tougher thing to do, really, on the Hatteras side, on the Atlantic side. And so that is the strategic knowledge that these guys put to use, but only because Gustavus Fox and Wells knew what to do. They applied their knowledge in a tremendously effective way. And not only that, even though they were very short of ships at the very beginning, they every time another ship would come online, they would put it where it was needed most. And unlike the Army, they got it right. That was the whole secret here. And that's just the ocean going. Okay, so they had two bases soon in 1862 on the Gulf side and two on the Atlantic side. All right, so we started to cover a little bit about the ocean part. Now, what makes it even more amazing was the river navy. Now, yes.
Yeah, before you get into the rivers, you didn't mention anything about the mouth, two factors. One is the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay.
Right.
And the other is, what about all the Gulf Coast that was on the Mexico side of the line? Were they able to take advantage of any of that as far as that ports?
Yeah, Matamoros, I forgot where exactly in Mexico.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, I don't think, I can address that because Texas was so far out of the way.
Sparse.
It was sparse and it was out of the way and there were no railroads to connect the port with where the staging areas where the supplies were came. And besides, after Vicksburg fell, even before Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy was basically cut in two anyway because they couldn't transport large groups and large supplies across the Mississippi in any consistent manner. So that was too isolated. Now, at the base of the Chesapeake was Fortress Monroe. That was in Union hands right from the outset.
On which side? North side?
The fort right at the right across from the Hampton Roads from Norfolk.
Because Eastern Shore, West Virginia. Too.
Right. But it was easy pickings because they could just go, the fort was there. The fort had already been built and it was a strong thing already. Now they reinforced it and they built it up even further. But that was a place that they could use perfect example. They used Fortress Monroe to build up a sufficient supply of Army and Navy assets to go across and threaten Norfolk Navy Yard, which they had lost. They tried to destroy the whole Gosport Norfolk Navy Yard, but they failed to do a thorough job of it. They didn't effectively blow up the dry docks, which was ordered, but they just didn't get it done in time. And the Confederates took that over and used that dry dock to finish off the U.S., well, the Monitor, the Merrimack. And when they rechristened it to Virginia, that's what effectively created the Battle of the Monitor and Merrimack in April of 1862. But by and large, they created from Fortress Monroe, that was such a strong base of operation that the Confederacy had virtually no chance of using that outlet to get to the river, to get to the Atlantic Ocean, and it was useless to them. And it was at the mouth of the crucial.
What's the river that goes up to Richmond?
The James.
James.
There was the James, the Rappahannock, and numerous others. But and the Appomattox River also comes down that way too. And think of all, it's not that the South was manufacturing things to export, but things that they needed badly to import, like ammunition, artillery, guns, and field rifles from England. They couldn't do it effectively from the very outset. And that was right where the capital was. So that was a huge disadvantage and a huge asset for the Union side. And the Navy was there to protect it. And there were so many troops there that that's literally why, that's what allowed McClellan to use Fort Monroe as one of the bases of his invasion as a concept of the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, that ended in June of 1862. They had Fortress Monroe gave them easy access to take over Norfolk. That's when they had to, Confederates had to scuttle the Virginia. The Union never destroyed the ironclad Virginia. The Confederates themselves destroyed it because they were losing, being overwhelmed, by Union troops. They were starting to invade the peninsula to start heading toward Richmond in, I guess it was March or April of 1862. So it was the Navy and that was basically heavily impacting what the military could do, and certainly impacting the supply operations of both sides. They was impeding the supply operations of the Confederacy and just allowing all kinds of easy access to resupply of the Navy and also the Army. In 1864, when Sherman had his march to the sea, he, marched down to Savannah area, but before he made his first contact, when he got down to the Atlantic, it was south of Savannah where he made contact with, I guess I forget, DuPont's squadron, where they reduced Fort McAllister at the mouth of the Savannah River, and they reduced that, together. From the ocean side and from the land side, and that's what established immediate supply from Sherman's army. After being, eating off the land for a month or so, 2 months, 2.5 months, on that 300-mile march, that's where the supply came in. So there was the Navy reconnecting. And after that, there was at one point where Sherman actually left the Army and went up to Virginia to meet with Grant and Lincoln at City Point, Virginia, to do a strategy session to how they were going to finish up the war. So there was another situation where the Navy was cooperating with the Army, and it worked throughout the war. But by 1864, it was just a matter of when. How long would Wilmington, Delaware, and Mobile, Alabama stay open?
Wilmington, North Carolina.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I? Okay. Wilmington, North Carolina. And so Hatteras was closed off, Elizabeth City, the northern thing was closed off. And the Army, the Navy had really done its job, and they were just finishing things off.
And they cut off, I guess, the commerce between England, cotton, huge cotton and tobacco, big commodities for them.
Right, and of course, the Confederates hurt themselves, because at the very beginning of the war, they declared an embargo on cotton to Europe, because they wanted to force Europe to recognize them and come into the war on their side. So while the North was most vulnerable to being able to actually block the cotton, the South cooperated greatly by hoarding their cotton and forcing England and France essentially to recognize the cotton. It didn't work that way. Why? Because England and France started using Egyptian cotton. That was good, but better than going to war with the United States. Meanwhile, they were fighting each other most of the time. So politically, it helped. Now, the Trent Affair almost destroyed that. That's one thing the Navy screwed up a little bit. In early 1862, the Trent, which was a British ship, which was basically not in one of the southern ports, but in the Indies, in the islands. That's where the Confederate blockade runners would go to Cuba or one of the Bahama Islands, drop off their stuff in Nassau especially. And it would be picked up by British ships. In this case, that was done, and the British ship was leaving Nassau, but it was intercepted by a Union vessel. And it just so happened that Mason and Slidell was a Louisianan, and they were going to be the ambassadors to England and France for the Confederacy. And they were captured and found by this Union Navy captain, and seized. And it created almost created a major confrontation for the Lincoln administration. And this is what Lincoln and Wells, who parted company on this. Lincoln was concerned about starting a war with England. But Wells wanted to support his captain, did what he was supposed to do. But he gave in. Lincoln won the day, and essentially military confrontation between England and the United States never happened. And Slidell and Mason were released. They went to England and they did what they were supposed to do. But that was an important thing that happened. The difficulty was that the United States couldn't shoot at British and French vessels. So they cooperated as well by doing all their transfers of cotton to the extent that they could in the Bahamas and Cuba. So that was the gray matter between England having to come to port in Wilmington or Mobile or Charleston. They didn't have to do that, because from their standpoint, they could evade direct confrontation with the United States, and the United States simply evade. But that was the Underground Railroad of getting cotton, whatever they could. And they did for, certainly at the beginning, they fairly well moved at will. The blockade runners were, pretty effective boats and ships.
Mickey, do you know when they started building Fort Jefferson? Because that's where the dry tortugas, Fort Jefferson, They were gonna use that as kind of like the guard gulf for any kind of intruders and stuff. Why did they build that there for? Because the trade, the
Right, they were, remember, the reason why the United States had their ships was not really to fight England, it was to avoid piracy. Those forts were there for the protection against piracy as much as anything prior to the war. And the war everything took a different turn. Okay, so there was Fox and Wells and everything and their people. Now comes the problem of dealing with the Western theater. And it seemed pretty apparent, it wasn't apparent to me, but to the military authorities who were fighting the war in the West, they saw the rivers as avenues of invasion. And they were. But how do you do that? You march your troops right down the shore of the river. I suppose that could be done. But that wasn't really.
Be careful, because I jumped ahead for you.
Oh, you did that.
I did.
Very good. That is an armed vessel, but that vessel would hold troops. And that's the kind of vessel that saved the Union Army at Shiloh. Why? Because do you think this would last long in the ocean? No. That was built for river traffic and river warfare at the same time. And you could mass, I don't know how many troops, you could get most of a regiment on there, and you get 6 or 7 of these ships, you could have an entire campaign. And that's what the Army of the Ohio under Fremont delivered about 14,000 men to Pittsburgh Landing over the course of an evening. And the day after as well. Not all 14,000 initiated the battle on the second day of Shiloh, but many of them were available, enough certainly to not hesitate to take the offensive. But that's the kind of vessel. You didn't see that on the river, on the Tennessee River or the Mississippi or the Ohio or River prior to the Civil War. They weren't needed. Nobody needed an arm, boats like that. But once the Civil War started, they were needed now. So how did that all happen? Wells happened to know a naval architect from Boston named Samuel Pook. Samuel Pook was a guy who did naval architecture privately for his own business in Boston. He was a New Englander. I don't know how he learned that art, that craft, but he learned it, and he knew he could take a ship, a riverboat, and conceptualize how much armor and artillery this river-going boat would use, and how much or how little water it would displace to be able to navigate up and down a large river like the Mississippi, to get down the Ohio to the Tennessee or the Cumberland River, and navigate those smaller rivers and not turn over. So he knew how to do the architecture, and he made the plans so they could adapt different sized boats. So that it wasn't just one immediate type of boat. If it was a riverboat and it was a sizable thing, it could be turned into an armed gunboat. And who was the architect? James Eads was the builder. This was the guy who grew up and his father was an opportunistic businessman whose business went south, no pun intended, went out of business essentially and left his family and his wife and his brothers and sisters in St. Louis. And this man had to move and was penniless, got educated at a school, in some public school, and got a job and was able to learn and read and learn and became a Mississippi River expert. He knew a lot about the rivers, not only the Mississippi, but the Cumberland and the Tennessee. He lived on the river. He worked on the river. And fortunately, his contact, he was a unionist, and he was Edward Bass of Missouri, who was in the cabinet. He was the postmaster general, attorney general, Edward Bass, appointed by Lincoln. Knew Eads because they were both Missourians, and Bates got Eads to come to Washington to meet with Wells, who connected them apparently with Pope. And Pope's architecture was understood by Eads, and Eads had access to the factory and the docks and the dry docks in St. Louis, the St. Louis suburb of Corungal, Missouri, was the first place that actually took Pope's concept and put it to practical use by Eads by September, October of 1861. And so that's when the first of the gunboats started coming across. In the first 5 months, I guess it was 6 months. In the first 6 months after this planning began, 7 gunboats were built at Corungal, Missouri, and across the river in Mound City, Illinois. That was a crucial step in creating a river fleet, because apparently what they knew about artillery, about the river, about the displacement of water, all came together. Oh, I thought about this, and that's almost miraculous how that had come together. And the first boats that they created were boats that lasted. A couple of them were sunk during the war, not necessarily in battle, but by accidents and stuff. But essentially, they just created this fleet, and within a few months, by February of 1862, the first 7 boats that they had created were in use on the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River, seizing and overtaking Forts Donaldson and
Henry.
Fort Henry. Thank you. And they were, there were problems. It was easier to take Fort Henry than Fort Donaldson because Fort Donaldson was more elevated. But there was enough elevation on these guns to do great damage even to Fort Donaldson. Now, it wasn't enough to do great, enough killing damage to overtake Vicksburg. But the point was that they could take many of the forts that the Confederacy had put up, and they did. And that allowed, they could see the strategy of this. Howard, who was in charge of the Western Theater at the time, and Grant, who was the doer, who would move his troops and use the gunboats to do the artillery aspect of it. And they were basically doing combined operations by the beginning of 1862. And by the middle of 1862, they had not only taken Forts Henry and Donelson, they had won the Battle of Shiloh, they had taken Memphis, they had taken New Orleans, they took over Nashville without any major battle, and they were in the heart of the Confederacy. In the Western Theater. The Western Theater may well have won the war, but this is why they won the Western Theater. Yes.
Wasn't Missouri a Confederate state?
Yes. No. No, it was a slave state, like Maryland, like Kentucky. And this is another part of the mirror of the Union. We talked about this in the border South course that we did. And that is that while Missouri was a slave state, there were 1 million Missourians and only about 115,000 slaves. And the slaves were basically in St. Louis and in some, for whatever reason, at Columbia, in the middle of the state. But they were in St. Louis for the same reason they were in New Orleans and Memphis, because they were working on the docks and they were essentially free blacks.
Okay.
Slaves. But the fact is that there was a large German abolition community in the St. Louis area. You know, Anheuser-Busch, you know, they're grand happies. But they were largely abolitionists. And when it came time for Governor Jackson of Missouri to get the state legislature to change, to secede, to get the pronouncement officially, that wasn't happening because of the resistance in the St. Louis area. When Governor Jackson tried to get General Price to take over, because there was a large arsenal in St. Louis, and the Confederates, of course, knew that. And what they wanted to do, they tried to take the arsenal. And so they were gathering a large group, not a large army, but a substantial force to be able to march into St. Louis and seize all those munitions the way they did at Harper's Ferry in the beginning of the war. But in this case, Franz Siegel, who was German, he was one of the leaders of the German the Republican political party that included all the abolitionist types in St. Louis. And Siegel and the statue of him. Siegel, another German leader. These guys organized the resistance, and with the knowledge of the Union in general, moved a lot of the equipment, the arms and ammunition across the river over to Illinois before they could attack. But they attacked anyway. But what happened was that the general lines on the Union side, in charge of Union troops, attacked the Confederate encampment south of St. Louis before they could really be ready to attack and fight. And they captured them. They attacked them, they defeated them, and they captured a lot of them. A lot of them escaped, but essentially broke up the Missouri Confederate militia at the very outset of the war. And what did that do? It opened it up for St. Louis to be a Union city throughout the war. And it was a crucial point because it was the place where Eads could start to build his river flotilla immediately. So it was sort of like there was no accident that it happened that way. But it was a slave state. Same with Kentucky. Kentucky had over 1 million people, had 250,000, had many more slaves even than Missouri. But they didn't secede either. Why? Because secession, slavery in Kentucky was limited to a small area. Interestingly, if you look at the map, which we saw in the earlier class today, there was, throughout the southern part of the state of Missouri, there was no, other than St. Louis, there was no great contingent or a slave or a black area where there were many heavily, plantation areas where there were many slaves per capita. The whole, when you look at that map, it doesn't show, like in many states in the South, there were certain areas that were heavily black. Mississippi, right across the river, and a little bit further south, they had, they had basically 60% of the whole population was black. And so here it was just 8%, 15%, if that.
Yeah, 0 to 9% was the majority of the state from the real estate regime perspective. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was amazing.
Right. So there weren't that many blacks, and the sense of desperation to secede from the Union, while it was strong with the slave owner, wasn't that strong otherwise. And so the state stayed in the Union, just like Kentucky, and just like Maryland.
Well, how did that work when the Emancipation Proclamation came out?
It was met with disdain.
Yeah.
Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation was only in the slave states, right? So it didn't affect the northern states. So it didn't.
Right.
Same
It
here.
Right.
And since Maryland, and it wasn't just a slave, it was the seceded states.
This is absolutely.
And Missouri was not a seceded state, nor was
Yeah,
Kentucky.
so it didn't affect.
Exception.
Or Maryland. Or Maryland.
Yeah.
But they knew slavery was dying anyway, so they basically did what they could to try to sell off their slaves and make whatever money they could. And so, but that's why it's amazing. I'm so glad you asked that question, because Missouri otherwise was a slave state, and it was so desperately needed because that's where the town of Cumberland was, and that's where the shipbuilding facilities were. And if those facilities weren't there, Mr. Eads couldn't have built those ships right from the outset of the war. So that's why it was such a, the border south had so much to do with it. But with the facility, roll the new gunboats off the river and put them right to work. And that was the value, amazing value, and happenstance of, and good fortune. And that's why men like Franz Siegel, who were good Republicans and supported Lincoln, that's why they had such a great impact right from the outset of the war. It would, if that had happened 2 years later, if the Confederates were able to control St. Louis, they would have been able to have those facilities. They wouldn't necessarily have been able to manufacture the armamentarium, the guns and the armor plating.
Oh, they didn't have it.
Now, I don't know exactly where that was all done, but there had to be some foundries right in Illinois, and it might have been right in St. Louis as well. But it was a pretty big city. But the fact is that it was available, and the South couldn't do that. And we'll talk about that later. But the South couldn't ever create or make adequate arms, armor
Plates.
for their boats. Not only that, they couldn't create engines strong enough to power those heavier boats much more than a few knots at that rate. And so for them, and even men like Franklin Buchanan, who was, and spent a lot of time in Alabama, he was having the worst time trying to find the armamentarium and the engine, and motors that would propel that big ship. I wasn't working on that this class. But he couldn't move that boat. That boat couldn't move. And so essentially, all of the boats that they had commandeered before the war and tried to make into gunboats, because they could see how effective they were in their use by the Union side, they couldn't do it. And so basically all they could do was become they could become like rams. They used a couple of them as rams, and they just used them as basic static defense fortifications in different cities on the water. But that's pretty useless.
Wow.
Probably didn't have any resource from engine boilers for, I guess, for the steam.
For whatever reason, they didn't have they didn't have access to the raw materials in the first place. And those raw materials had to go into cannons and other products, because they were fighting, they were losing the land. And that was, understandably, that would have to be their priority. So Eads, his role was crucial in all of this. And so, they built a total of 30 on-gun poop turtles during the war. Not always the same size, but the specifications, they knew the flotation issue, and how much water it would displace. I mean, it was terrific nautical, naval science and architecture, and the technical application of the mathematical principles won the day. That was, I'm amazed by that story. And, I guess now when I read about the battle, this battle, that battle, I know where those riverboats came from. That's, it builds, it's a really important perspective. After the war, Eads built that first Mississippi River Bridge. It still stands today.
Wow.
It was a combination of roadway and train, the third train bridge over the river. So, I mean, he's and of those first 8, 2 were lost, 5 retired, 1 was preserved. I'm not sure where it is preserved today, but they came to stay, essentially. But these are the specs for the first ones. And that was the beam, and it could stand a certain amount of weight, and the armamentarium was a certain angle so that shells would bounce off of it. I mean,
That's why they had the angle on the
Yeah.
side of the.
yeah, and that, World War II, the tanks, the tanks did the same thing. Yeah. So that is. Okay, so let's talk, we talk about Cook, we talk about him a little bit. This is your classic gunboat. See the angle?
Yeah.
And there's enough guns, and there was metal just at the water line where they didn't have torpedoes, on the river. And so, as long as these people were protected, those boats could just move back and forth. Since they were moving targets, they weren't easy for forts to hit them. They did hit them, and they did disable them from time to time, but they were repaired. They couldn't really do too much damage under the water line, and that's unless it was some lucky shot or it just hit low, but that didn't really happen terribly often. So that plus the troop ships, where it was going to be very dangerous, they would have unarmed troop ships, but guarded by these turrets, and they could move large numbers of troops, even in early 1862, like they did with the Army of the Ohio at Shiloh. And to think that they could actually do that in April 1862 and win a major battle in southern Tennessee was a major statement of military skill and prowess. So, then, of course, first, these were, battles using gunships, with armed gunships with metal. And so the Monitor, the Merrimack, gets all the pink, from the press, because that was the first two sides using, armed, metal protected ships. But it was going on in the Western theater of the Civil War, where before the war, there was no such thing. So, that was, to me, a major bit of news. Okay. There was Andrew Foote. He was the head of the Mississippi Squadron on the river, and he worked most closely with Grant on the Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh, getting the troops and to be protected. He didn't last very long. He died. He was being promoted again by Wells, but he died of kidney failure, nephritis, en route to take command of the Southeast Flying Squadron on the Atlantic coast. So the Foote was lost, but he was there at the right moment at the right time. And what was he doing at the beginning of the war? He was the commander of the Brooklyn Navy, and he was aware of what they were talking about with the Monitor. And amazingly, the thing that amazes me most about the Monitor itself was that it was built in how many days? 101 days by the Brooklyn Navy. Just conceptually, it had all those patentable features about it, the rotating turret, all that. 101 days. Pretty amazing. Okay.
That would be amazing in today's, if we have electricity and all those power tools, and that would still be an amazing short time to do.
It takes the bureaucracy longer to.
The bureaucracy wasn't big enough to stop.
There weren't enough bureaucrats.
Okay. This is a snapshot of the whole war on the waters. Now you should have it in your handout here. You don't have it with you right now, but essentially.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning, right, the handouts are in the thing that was mailed to you this morning. There's the link.
Well, now we got the three, I made 3 copies and there's 3 of these.
Oh, very nice, because I couldn't figure it out.
Now up here, it's Fortress Monroe. That's the mouth of the Chesapeake. And this is Roanoke Island, which was taken in February of 1862. That was an outlet to the ocean. This is the Hatteras Inlet, which was occupied in August of 1861. Wilmington was open virtually throughout the war. Fort Fisher protected Wilmington, and it was taken not until January of 1865. So that was the big true thing that they never quite saw. They had plenty of ships to be there waiting for blockade runners, but they couldn't officially close it off until the very end of the war. Port Royal, which is where one of the bases was started. They went originally in November 1861. They knew where they could go. They knew it was safe. They knew it could be defended. They went there and established it. Fernandina, Florida, March 1862. That's basically where I believe that's in the Jacksonville area, and that's where the port there's a big naval base down there now, but that was
Jacksonville.
Yeah, exactly. I forgot the Maine port or something like that, Florida. But this is how they began to assert control, and they did that by setting up the 2 bases.
They never took Charleston.
Right.
Because if you look at the map of Charleston, there's like 4 or 5 forts there, and trying to get in there, you're just going to get.
Right. The only fort that was really a tough one was Fort Sumter. The other forts, Sullivan and the other ones on the, they were Revolutionary War.
There.
Yeah. But the fact is that there were so many ships, after a while, there were so many ships right outside the harbor that it became a rarity when a blockade runner could get out. And then on the Gulf side, there was Mobile Bay in 1864. They couldn't shut off, they couldn't close off Mobile until 1864, August. But that was the last port on the Gulf that the Confederates could use. New Orleans was shut off by April of 1862. That was the biggest. I mean, New Orleans was the biggest city in the Confederacy. And certainly the largest port by far. But whatever they could get out, they could get, and there's another map that I'll show you in a minute. But there's New Orleans, the passage, Forts Jackson and St. Philip down at the mouth, well below New Orleans. That's what was taken, and that's when, from that action, from those points, they could control the river traffic and essentially cut off and make it easy for a fleet to amass and come upriver and fire at New Orleans. And New Orleans had no effective fort system to protect it, and those gunboats could have just leveled the city, and so the city saw that, and in April, they surrendered without a fight. So at least they didn't destroy the French port. Very pleased. And so, but there's your anaconda from this section, and when you look at Memphis being taken in June of 1862, New Orleans captured April 1862, Memphis June 6, 1862, Island Number 10, April 7th, 1862, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, February, Fort Donelson, 10 days after taking Fort Henry. So the anaconda was squeezing in the Western Theater immediately. And even though they didn't take Vicksburg until July of 1863, it hardly mattered because the Confederates couldn't use it. They couldn't even cross it effectively. Not only could they not use it for traffic, they couldn't even cross it effectively, even before it fell. And they couldn't get across to Memphis. You're familiar with how they used to do that. And the best example I can think of is the Susquehanna River. They had the trains would take you to the edge of the river, and they had the big steamers, ferries. You just roll the trains right onto the ferry, and the ferry would go across the river, and the trains would be just pulled out by the train, the new tracks on the other side. And that's
Charles saying it.
People stay on the train cars?
Yes, yeah.
There's no way.
This is where like 95 goes down, where the
Yeah, it's very easy. As a matter of fact, my wife, I dragged her to Perryville, Maryland, which is the north side of the Susquehanna, and all the track is right there, where all those Union troops came down very early in the war. I had to see that, and it went right across the river. Yeah, I didn't see where they embarked again and went south, but there was a similar little place station right on the other end of the other side of the Susquehanna, and it's within you see the 95 bridge. You can't throw a rock, but you can shoot a gun. But the point is that's how they cross rivers, and from the south, you know. With the Mississippi, there were so many Union gunboats up and down the river. They knew where the train stations were, so they just hunkered down right nearby and always were there, and made it virtually impossible for the South to effectively move any numbers of troops Even before the fall of Pittsburgh.
Southwest of the wall. After,
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. I'm thinking, holy cow.
They were hungry.
This, this is why, this portion, they couldn't effectively take, like Selma, Alabama, and Birmingham. Those were two areas where the South had major munition, and furnaces to build the kind of, stuff they needed. Did they have enough raw materials? No. And so they did what they could. And, by and large, they did a pretty good job with what they had. They just didn't have nearly enough. And, unfortunately for them, they couldn't take back the firing on Fort Sumter after it was done. And they started realizing that talk did not equate to reality. So, but that is essentially, how Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan came to fruition under, I think, brilliant leadership of my friend, Mr. Wells, and his group of leaders.
Sorry, I just didn't want you to forget you wanted to show that last.
Yes, I did. Thank you for making those up too. This is where Nassau and other places, here's Cuba, Havana. This is where the blockade runners, they weren't, blockade runners weren't going to cross the Atlantic. They were just shoveling stuff out. And they would get, a lot of them went to Nassau, and that's 570 miles from Wilmington to Nassau. Bermuda, St. George and Bermuda, 674 miles to Wilmington, Cape Fear River. That's how they tried to do it. And so the Union, with their blockading squadrons headquartered right here with the bases, they didn't have to travel to get resupplied. Supplies came down to the base. And they kept their ships, a large number of their ships, on station throughout virtually the whole war. And as time went on, there were enough ships to basically strangle those southern cities without invading. The Anaconda Plan was a great concept, and it worked, but only because of the brilliance of the people who were doing the shouldering the responsibility of actualizing. Questions? Comments?
Very insightful.
I'll tell you, their leadership was much better in the Navy than it was in the Army.
I mean, they didn't have Burnside, they didn't have McClellan, I mean, they didn't have all these guys that were just not competent. That's the trick. They got the right guys in the right place at the right time at the very beginning, and they just went to work. Now, did they have to deal with political pressure? Yes. One of the things that Wells did was when they were in the process of acquiring ships, both ocean going and river going, people were trying to sell their boats. And sometimes the boats were junked. And that was the political, waste. And it applied to that too. What they did effectively was they managed to, Wells managed to appoint people to do the buying. And one of the, just like he went and forgot about the seniority, he didn't really care about the net. He knew that his brother-in-law, George Morgan, really knew that business. So he appointed his brother-in-law as the buyer for New York, where a lot of that business started. And so his brother did a fabulous job of getting good boats to build on, turn into the armed vessels that were used. So he used the system to
He abused an abusive system.
exactly. So, I mean, that's the extent to which I think that, I mean, from my standpoint, as a guy who really reads about the war and I never get enough information, I never knew that until I started to do this. So I think that, you know, to have that extra perspective goes a long way to explain how the war was won.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. We'll next week and the week after, we'll get into a lot of the details of how these things are managed. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. So thank you for being here. Thank you guys for attending out in Zoom land. And we'll see you next time around. Take care.